the frustration, the anger, the alienation that we felt when we came home, to me, are signs of sanity and not insanity.
When I saw that other veterans, looked at the wars the same way as I did, and I became active in it, that was my therapy. And the physical acts of going and confronting the government were my therapy and brought me back home.
I'm from upstate New York, and I'd like to turn in my Bronze Star and 2 Purple Hearts. I lost my leg in Vietnam, and I'm totally opposed to this war we're carrying on over there. And Senator Buckley and Congressman James Hanley will receive my medals next week in the mail. Thank you.
The reason that VVAW exists is partly to help the veteran come home, partly to help us do rap groups, and mostly to let us realize that the activism is the only therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder that's going to keep us relatively sane. It's the only therapy for anything that ails this world. And I think that if we can get the young people into activism and into fighting and looking at justice issues and being conscientious now, maybe we won't have to fight any more post-traumatic stress disorder afterwards.
At one point, the Milwaukee chapter kind of developed a strategy of making our anti-war work social. I mean, of socializing in terms of, now we're not just out there to be against the war, we're also out there for our own survival. We heard about the homeless stand-downs that have been happening. We didn't know what we'd find when we went there the first time. But there's maybe 600 veterans going through there, 600 to 700 actual veterans, and then a couple hundred staff. Most of them are, if they're not too young, a lot of them are veterans. So it was that feeling of being in a group of people that really had something in common again. So again, it was a trade-off between we're doing something for them and they're doing something for us.
There's a variety of different social services. The court system is here to help clear up things for people if they have warrants out against them. The driver's license and state ID facilities are set up for people to get identification cards. The job services there offering jobs. There's a whole list of different things. There's a haircutting school that sends its students there to give these guys haircuts. So there's a whole list of things in addition to the meals that we provide over the course of the 3 days.
Paybacks are a real bitch, you know what I mean? You never get over participating in something as horrendous as armed conflict, armed warfare. I joined a club. It's the 8.5 pounds pressure club. And that's about how much pressure it takes to pull the trigger. So once you pull the trigger and take a life, you're a member for life. You don't get out.
Most of these men and women had powerful ideas of community to start with. Indeed, one of the reasons they went to Vietnam, and many of these people were volunteers and not just draftees, they went because they believed in their communities, and they were, in a sense, soldiers for their communities. That was part of their whole motivation.
My father's always been very active. He was a steel worker, and some of the first picket lines I ever saw is he took me out when I was young and to some of the steel worker picket lines for strikes, like in the 50s and early 60s, I believe, and then he became an auto worker.
I was born and raised in Chicago, working class family. My father was a factory worker for 40 years. My mother worked in factories and in department stores. Was raised basically to be a good Catholic boy.
12 years of Catholic school and tons of anti-communist indoctrination. And you graduate in 1965, and a war is beginning in Vietnam, fighting communism. And so it's seen as a way to help your fellow Catholics in Vietnam and fight communism at the same time.
The American war in Vietnam was an all-American war. That's the kind of war the United States has almost always fought. The oldest war in our history of the Indian Wars. The United States has been at war with the native nations since before there was a United States. And what were those wars about? They were wars between the Americans and the Indians over who was going to own and occupy the land that the Indians owned, that the Indians occupied. We fought a war with the Mexicans over a part of Mexico, and we won, and we call it Texas. We fought a war in the Philippines with first the Spanish and then with the Filipinos over who was going to run the Philippines, and we won, and the Philippines was an American colony for 40 years. Almost every war the United States has ever fought has been a war between the United States and the people of some other country over who's going to run that country.
I did not realize that to the Vietnamese, I was not a young American savior. I was an invading foreign soldier. They had had the French, then the Japanese in World War II, then the French came back. And see, I didn't have any understanding of this whole historical process that the Vietnamese had been dominated by foreign powers for so long that it didn't matter who you were or where you were from, you were another foreign soldier in their country.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
I was going to do 20 years when I went in. Fancying myself a patriot, decided, for the good of country and the fact that as a free citizen I owed my country some service and all this other stuff. I enlisted and was in basic training 2 weeks after I graduated from high school.
If you come from a working class family, it gives you a chance to possibly go to college because of the GI Bill.
Everybody was influenced by the propaganda, as you might call it. Actually, I was really opposed to a lot of the stuff that went on at school in terms of pep rallies, things like that. I really hated it. But somehow I got caught up in the whole war fever. It never occurred to us, to really look at what was going on.
When I was in boot camp at Parris Island, I went through a process of being dehumanized and made into a Marine. And their stated purpose was that they were just going to make lean, green killing machines out of us. They wanted people who would instantly follow orders, would not hesitate to shoot another human being, and the easiest and most efficient process for doing that is that you totally dehumanize the other people.
The military runs on racism and sexism. They're institutionalized. The women are all whores because they're not as good as, they're not white, they're not Western, they're obviously inferior, they're ignorant, they're uncivilized. And the dehumanization process, what makes it easier for you to discount how you treat them, and also makes it easier to kill them.
To make the transition from being a civilian to being a warrior, you have to destroy the civility that you were brought up with. You have to destroy that core of belief. Or you're going to say, well, if you're a religious person, you'll say, well, the Bible says thou shalt not kill. How can I kill? So in order to get you to kill, you have to destroy the foundation and put a different foundation there. You have to destroy the beliefs that a person holds and replace it with beliefs you want them to hold.
"What's the spirit of the bayonet?" the drill sergeant screamed. "To kill," replied the 250 trainees, all coming to the en-garde position, weapon ready, 8.5 inches of cold, pointed steel at the barrel's end, gleaming, ready, waiting. "Long thrust, movement, and hold, move, kill," screamed the 250, each thrusting forward with their rifle, aiming at an invisible enemy's throat, bayonet gleaming, 8.5 inches of pointed death. "Withdrawn, hold, move, kill," screamed the 250s, withdrawing their bayonets, now bloodied, dripping from that invisible enemy's throat.
In Southeast Asia, we want nothing more and nothing less than the assured and guaranteed independence of the peoples of that area. We are in Southeast Asia to help our friends preserve their own opportunity to be free of imported terror, of alien assassination managed by the North Vietnam communists based in Hanoi and backed by the Chinese communists from Peking. Aggression by terror against the peaceful villagers of South Vietnam has now been joined by open aggression on the high seas against the United States of America. The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage. Yet our response for the present will be limited and fitting.
The war that we were fighting in Vietnam was a war for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. That was the war that we were fighting. That was what defending democracy in Vietnam meant. Now, the problem was that we had to persuade the Vietnamese people to support a brutal and corrupt puppet regime that we had installed in Saigon, which oppressed its own people, which exploited its own people, which stole right and left, stole from us, stole from each other, stole from everybody under the sun. A brutal and corrupt regime. Our job was to persuade the Vietnamese people to support that government. And in the end, the only means of persuasion left to us was to kill them.
Well, when you first get there, you're so amazed by everything and so overawed. I mean, you've got all of the propaganda that they've given you and all of the fear. You look around for everyone to be a terrorist and to throw a hand grenade at you, and it takes a while for you to settle down and to actually be able to see. But quite frankly, I think 2 weeks after being in the field, I knew it wasn't worth any of my men getting killed.
We got off the plane. Of course, it's hot and everything, you know. We spent 13, 14 hours in this aircraft. We finally get off the plane. We're walking around. There's just, you know, you're brand new. You don't know what's going on. Your heart's pumping. You're expecting, you know, Viet Cong everywhere you look. And they put you on this bus. And it's about, 15, 20-minute ride to the 9th Replacement Battalion, where you'll then get your unit assignment and be sent to your unit. And there's like chicken wire all around the windows. And I'm sitting there and I'm kind of looking around, and these other guys are kind of doing the same thing, you know, and somebody asked this sergeant that was in charge of the group, you know, what's with the wire? And the guy said, well, that's so that it keeps the rocks and bottles and hand grenades from coming through the windows, you know, from the Vietnamese, you know. And I'm thinking, well, if I'm here to protect these people and save them from communism, why would they throw hand grenades at me, you know, and rocks and bottles?
And you could just see it in terms of you would be out on patrol, and you could see what made up our side in terms of Korean troops, which I worked with, which were incredibly brutal. I mean, in terms of wiping villages out, killing children, in terms of our Saigon allies who would refuse to fight. And then you would see the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese, and they would fight to the death. I mean, when they ran out of bullets, they'd start throwing rocks.
I'll grind this up in a hurry. I know many people have said, look, we've killed innocent people. Our bombs have killed civilians and babies and mothers. And I suppose there is truth to that. There have been people that have been killed. But your government has not bombed civilians. Your government has not bombed open cities. Your government has sent its bombers in after targets, military targets, that have been placed in an area surrounded by civilians.
So one day we knew that this is a very, very big operation. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was a big operation. And what it was all the planes from Guam, Thailand, South Vietnam, and all the planes on the carriers, the 2 carriers that were out, or 3 carriers that were out. We all went into Haiphong to take out a oil refinery. And what happened was that we took out, the refinery got taken out. What happened was the bombing pattern was like concentric circles with less and less bombs as you go out. But we bombed the whole city. And not only did we bomb the whole city, we started firestorms, like Dresden. So at that point, that's when I really, that turned me around. I knew this was immoral. And I knew that I was involved in an immoral thing.
We thought nothing of just burning a village down or bulldozing it down or burning it, just. So they had you set up from the beginning that you're dealing with less than human people here, or you're dealing with less than humans. So they're pretty much animals and they're fair game, they're rodents, so we have to exterminate them.
One day, as the helicopter was getting ready to take off, there was an explosion on the far end of the fire base at Tam Key. And what happened was a number of Vietnamese children were bringing back an unexploded 105 white phosphorus round. White phosphorus is a chemical that can't be put out with water. You're taught in training that if it lands on you and it falls on your hand, that you don't put it underwater. What you do is you turn it and you let it burn out the same hole that it burned in. If you were to leave it like this, gravity and the chemical would actually burn through you. And so the children would go out and find American unexploded rounds and get paid for it. And we would pay them 120 piastres, which was $1. And they were carrying this back, and it exploded. And 3 or 4 of the children vaporized. They simply ceased to exist. And there was one little girl who was somewhere between the ages of like 9 and 14. And her face was untouched. She was beautiful from the neck up. And from the neck down, she had cuts and burns and was bleeding. So I jumped out of the helicopter and I ran to her and I wrapped my poncho around her, which is like a rubber rain slick, and carried her into the helicopter. And I wrapped it around her because we have a metal floor, and quite frankly, she would have stuck to the floor if she hadn't had this as a protector. And she whined like a little cat, not like a person who's just been burned over 90% of their body and was in a state of shock. And we flew to Tam Key, or rather we flew to Chu Lai, where there was a naval hospital. And unlike MASH, where they bring in civilians and everybody in the base goes crazy and says, oh, we can't wait to have this child, I jumped out with this little girl in my arms and ran to the American doctor, who took one look at her and said, we don't take Vietnamese nationals here.
But I got a shock, I mean, right out the gate. I'm there and Tet starts. You know, I've been there like a week and boom, you know, my whole concept of the place, to a large degree, has just taken a major turn here. Wow, this isn't what I thought it'd be at all. I was more or less under the impression that if the United States wasn't winning the war, at least it was holding its own.
when I got there, I got all the war stories from the Big Tet, which was called 68, the 68 Tet. And that will forever be the Big Tet. So the guys were telling me that before the offensive started, there was like a belt of NVA units all around Hue. And they're all clustered right around there. And they told, of course, the generals were all told about it and everything. Now, they didn't do anything. So, you know, then the Tet hits and everybody, we get our ass kicked. And they were stacking up bodies on the runways, literally, at Fubai Airport. They were stacking up bodies, and all the planes were leaving with bodies, and all they were coming in with was ammunition.
They couldn't come out and say, gee, fellas, you're being had. You know, and all these people back in America know that you're being screwed. You know, they couldn't do that. So they blamed the protest movement. They blamed Jane Fonda. They blamed, you know, all these people for our problems. They never said anything about the military incompetence, the leadership incompetence, the stupid foreign policy, the fact that the Secretary of Defense, McNamara, which I had no understanding of at the time, knew back in '61 that there was going to be problems, we shouldn't get involved, you know, and all this other stuff, and they just escalated because of the Cold War. You know, they didn't tell us that. Of course not. They're not going to say that, because then you might start shooting them.
You know, we hear Armed Forces Radio talk about some astounding victory with low casualties, and we'd say, well, Jesus, what's low and what's high, you know? Because, you know, after you'd hauled 3 or 4, you know, you'd flown 3 or 4, like, planes back out just loaded with wounded or dead, regardless of their nationality or whatever. Well, what's acceptable casualties here? And you begin to see that they were inflating things tremendously. And you could talk to some of these guys like, well, what were you up against? We don't know if it was company strength or brigade, or we don't know. You know, but they chewed us up pretty good.
In the field, resistance occurs. It occurs in a lot of ways. One, as fragging. This is a very desperate act in which soldiers killed or attempt to kill or wound their officers. There were 800, at least 800, between 800 and 1,000 documented events. And if you add all the undocumented ones, which there must have been, these would truly be endemic in the service, particularly after '68. Most of these attacks were premeditated, or many of them were. They happened in the rear, in base camps, and it happened to commanders who often harassed troops, were risked men in missions that were somewhat questionable. But I think that points to the fact that the soldiers simply didn't believe in the mission.
And the worst thing in the world you wanted to be around was a boot second lieutenant who had just gotten in country because he was just too damn dumb to know what he was doing. And he came out of OCS with a hard charge and kick-ass attitude, and you'd be out in the field with him and he would not listen to the experienced NCOs, the platoon sergeants, squad leaders who'd tell him, look, no, we can't go this way. We got to do it a different way. No, we're going to do this a frontal assault. Well, if you guys get killed each time you do this, and pretty soon half the people you started out with are dead or wounded. And a lot of it was done for self-preservation.
A lot of guys, you know, were clever enough to figure out what was going on. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment. People some of them had a fairly developed idea of what we were really in Vietnam for. I can remember us talking about oil and stuff like that. But it wasn't solidified very much. What we mainly did, of course, was we really knew that we hated the lifers and we really hated the military.
Now, it's not to say that I was so numb as not to see or even try to answer the questions as to why the reason for the fighting at all. You know, I took the code of honor to mean you don't kill who you are sent to protect. So I did answer, and the military said, still your tongue, close your eyes to the questions of My Lai and bombs.
So if you're taught to distance yourself from your feelings and to distance yourself from people unlike yourself, and particularly women saw this when guys came back from the war. the pain had taken on a kind of brutal edge. That enforced brutality poisons relationships, and very often women are particularly the brunt of that kind of poison.
We allowed ourselves to go to a country that we knew nothing about and commit genocide, learn to hate and kill people, learn to recognize women not as women, children not as children. And when you answer to yourself for that, like I did while I was serving in Vietnam, it's kind of a bummer. You realize that you're not a man because you have a gun, you're not a man because you kill.
And you get home, and now all of a sudden you look around you and you see that America hasn't changed. People think they know what's going on in Vietnam because they see it for 5 minutes on Walter Cronkite. And you see people that are going on with their lives, and you know that there's 1 million, and I'm not joking, 1 million Indochinese dying, and you know that there's 10, 12,000 Americans dying, and you know that there's 45,000 Americans being wounded, and people around you don't seem to grasp it.
And there wasn't a lot of respect around, at all for Vietnam veterans. I had run-ins with some of my relatives and stuff over, the war and everything, and they just had no respect for us being in the service. And that was very strange to me because I had been brought up always to, respect veterans, and at least for being in the service and listen to what they had to say. And then we came back, and suddenly what we had to say wasn't shit. No one wanted to hear it. As soon as you said, well, maybe we shouldn't be there or whatever, that was it.
There was a lot of attitude about vets. So we did not, basically I was trying to find other vets because I couldn't relate. And I also didn't want to talk to people who had attitudes about me just because I was a vet, which most did.
When I first got out of the service, I found it difficult to identify myself as a vet, and I never really connected with anybody. There was no organization that I felt comfortable with. I hung around SDS for a while, worked with Young Socialist Alliance for a while in these early days, and just went to demos. I was just a demonstrator. I was just one of the thousands.
People always ask me, what was the founding moment of VVAW? And I always think, which one? There was a march on April 15th, 1967, here in New York from Central Park to the United Nations. And I went to it because I had seen an advertisement in the New York Times book review section that Veterans for Peace were going to participate in this march of the peace movement. And they caught my attention by saying, if North Vietnam really wanted peace, they should stop bombing the United States.
Initially, VVAW started at a demonstration where a few vets showed up at a peace demonstration. They discovered very quickly some common ground that they shared with no one else but each other. And they started talking about their Vietnam experience in ways that nobody else had. Vets came home, they were isolated with their families, this was not coming home in units, and they had nobody to talk to because vets found very quickly that when they talked to most people went, oh my God.
We related to the GIs. We related to the sailors. These were us. They were us,
Well, to me, the value of Vietnam Veterans Against the War was that they were war veterans speaking out against the war. And I think that war veterans are the only people that know how to talk about war, because they're the only people who lived through the war. The dead ones aren't going to talk, and the politicians are getting way, way far away from it, and the historians too. So they're the only people qualified to talk about the war.
VVAW, from the very beginning, wanted to be that presence that lent credibility. That presence that said, no, you are wrong when you say this is an anti-American, anti-patriotic, cowardly bunch of draft dodgers. This is your sons and your grandsons and the people you taught to care about this country, the people who went to war when the country called, and the people who are coming back to say this war is wrong.
How could you challenge now the authority of a soldier, of a veteran who was there? Often the VVAW were combat veterans. 80% of the Vietnam vets against the war were combat veterans. This is during the period. So they had a very powerful authority. And it was very convincing to a lot of people. And of course, you couldn't call them cowards. You couldn't say that they didn't know what they were talking about, that they had no right to speak. And so that was a very convincing thing to a lot of people in the American public. So therefore, they became a very powerful part of the way in which a majority of Americans came to oppose the war in Vietnam.
We were the first TV generation, so you would have this combination of people who have been through the most intense experience you can be through, which combat is, where you've killed people and you've seen your friends killed and you've lost parts of your body. And you've grown up with TV. In fact, TV and the movies are 50% of what sent you to Vietnam.
Movements are about symbols. Movements are about how we define the world. It's the catchphrase, a choice of words is a choice of worlds. Images. No social movement in the 20th century can have very much impact without being able to control the media and to control its own representation through powerful symbols.
The vets were extremely creative in their approach to history. And what Dewey Canyon does, in a sense, is be very creative in terms of ceremony. They take the awards ceremony, in which men receive honors for their War I efforts and actions, and they turn it on its head. They say, well, sure, we deserve these medals, but the giver didn't have the right to give them. The giver was illegitimate. The military and the government that gave me these medals is not a legitimate government. It's not guided by the people. It ignores the majority sentiment, and it continues on in this immoral and futile war.
We were all there for the same reason, essentially, and that sounds kind of trite, but there was a big feeling of brotherhood. We all called each other brother, you know, and we meant it. So we shared everything. You know, we had, it was kind of like instant socialism. We were ultra-democratic in some ways. I'd say it's important to stress that the leadership of the thing, Al Hubbard and these other guys that put the thing on, really did a good job. We had a feeling we were doing something. We knew it was big time, but we didn't know how big. We just wanted to get down there and get the beast by the throat, which we did.
I pray that time will forgive me and my brothers for what we did. And only those lumping pigs behind those closed doors will have to suffer, and not the young kids and the unborn kids.
Right on, bro. Paul F. Ware, Spec 4 Army, retired. I'm taking in 9 Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Army Commendation, and a lot of other shit. This is for my brothers. Right on, right on.
My name is Ed Heights. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It's with a great deal of pleasure I return the Bronze Star and several other of these pieces of garbage.
Joe Hirsch from New York City. Maybe this will help to save lives.
Sal Graziano, New York. I don't want your fucking war.
Robert Jones, New York. I symbolically return all Vietnam medals and other service medals given me by the power structure that has genocidal policies against non-white peoples of the world.
Right on.
All power to the people.
My name is Ralph Swain. I'm also from Fort Collins, Colorado. I was a corpsman. And I'm turning in everything I got, including just the Army Commendation Medal. And I hope that someday I can return to Vietnam and help rebuild that country that we tore apart.
The activism of most of VVAW in the early days didn't start as activism and grow into post-traumatic stress work. It started as post-traumatic stress work, at examining their war experiences and the traumas that built, and drove them to activism.
I guess being on this convoy relieves some of the guilt feelings I feel for what I did in Vietnam. Before I left Vietnam, my company was doing a search and destroy mission, and on this search and destroy mission, we hit some heavy NVA fire, heavy mortar shelling, and some women and children got wounded about 25 meters from me. I was behind a rock. I was pretty well protected. I could hear them screaming and yelling, and I didn't go out to help them because I only had 2 more weeks to go before I went back to the world, and I wasn't taking any chances at all.
We decided we were going to the political conventions to protest the war. We were no longer the people we used to be. That by being in the service and by serving in combat, that we had changed. And there was never going to be any way we could go back. There was never any way we could change what we had seen or what we had done. And I think a lot of that was the motivation for stopping the war, for us being Vietnam veterans against the war.
Going to the Republican convention that night, the night of the march, there were choppers overhead, so the vets were very chilled. These guys had been in Nam with choppers overhead all the time, so this put everybody into combat mode.
Crazy people inside there to stop this war. What do? They run us over, they kill us in the streets. So either they kill you in Vietnam, or they kill you back home in the streets. You can't win as a Vietnam veteran in this country. Goddamn crime. That man inside there is a lunatic. That man inside there is a criminal. We saw it in Vietnam, and we see it here in the streets right now. Crimes. Our brothers are being brutalized, broken in the streets, and they're being killed in Vietnam right now. Now that man is crazy, and these people in here, these delegates, they are representing a man who is committing crimes against humanity. I gave 3/4 of my body in Vietnam. My brother doesn't have to get knocked down into the streets here. For what?
The war was wrong. We knew that. There was a fundamental problem with America. We sensed it, but we didn't really have an understanding. It was through the VVAW experience that we came to learn about our culture and how it is fundamentally a racist society, how it is fundamentally a militaristic culture. We came to learn about our economy as a war-based economy. And we came to learn about our government and about the sense of democracy and freedom that we had grown up being taught, having been taken over by the state.
GI benefits? Well, on the record, there's quite a few GI benefits, but you have to fight more fiercely here for them than we did over in Vietnam. It took me 6 months to get Social Security disability because they said that I wasn't disabled, and I had to repeal it twice, and it was just a big hassle over it. And the benefits are there on record, but try to get them. You know, a lot of veterans are having a hell of a problem trying to get these benefits.
We went more from being anti-war when the war ended to being a group that, well, we declared war on the VA. And we fought for the question of a single discharge, because discharge had been issued to people racially, I mean, it was incredible in terms of Afro-Americans and Chicanos and Native Americans. They got like 50% of all bad discharges. And with Agent Orange, while other people said, this is communist propaganda, the U.S. wouldn't use chemicals, you guys are way offline. Well, of course, we know now that that supposed communist propaganda was truth. And the stuff that said that Agent Orange was safe was capitalist propaganda.
VA cuts have got to go. VA cuts have got to go. Heidi, 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 hey. Heidi, 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 hey. To the cuts we say no way. To the cuts we say no way.
VVAW played a strong part in addressing the Agent Orange issue, but underneath that, without any other publicity, this is the organization that identified post-traumatic stress, convinced the profession that it existed, convinced the profession that it had to be dealt with, convinced the federal government by writing the legislation that the VA had to deal with this, and then fought the bureaucratic battle of the last 10 years to keep those programs in place.
Well, post-traumatic stress is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation.
Your startle reaction is very extreme. So if you're startled, you're likely to either hit the dirt or jump in the air. You have flashbacks. You don't necessarily have all of these. You have flashbacks, which means that you suddenly find yourself back in the trauma place. You think you're there. It's your whole consciousness is around there. That, as opposed to where you are, in fact, at that moment. You have nightmares. You have sleep disturbances at the beginning of the night, at the end of the night, and you have nightmares in between. Some people have cold sweats or sweats so bad that the whole bed gets soaked.
Post-traumatic stress disorder came out of post-Vietnam syndrome, came out of the work. And anyone who doubts that it's work has never had a trauma. That VVAW members initially did, the courage that they showed, being willing to share their experiences with one another in a situation where they built a situation where they wouldn't hurt each other.
This church was here during the American Revolution. My understanding is that the revolutionaries met here and the Tories met down the street at Trinity Church, the main church. That is our tradition in this country that we have come back to in a sense of meeting here today. And one of the things that it took a while for the government and some people in this country to realize is, those of us who were protesting the Vietnam War, we knew where we came from. We knew what our roots were, which is when something is wrong, you do something about it. I'd like to ask Bill Earhart to start us off with a couple of poems.
A lot of you may know Larry Heinemann's book, Paco's Story. There's a reference in this poem to Paco, and that's what I'm talking about. And this poem was prompted by a reading that I heard Larry give. It's called Unaccustomed Mercies. My kiss surprised you, but you didn't turn away. No, you remember it still, smiling, feeling a living warmth against your neck, even now. After your reading about the war, it was only a way of saying thanks for surviving, for writing, your murderous humor slicing the sinew of what men do to be men to the white bleeding bone. So many go stumping about, lost in alcohol, lost in their worst nightmares, missing an arm, a leg, unable to find a way out of the past, angrily vacant, calling themselves men. Someone ought to kiss them too. Someone ought to have kissed them years ago, before the war, before their first football game, before the last time they saw their fathers naked. Think of it. All that steel. the hatred, the generations consumed for want of unaccustomed mercies men might receive if only they knew how. What shall we give our children? Paco's company blown to jungle junk by our own obsessions, or a graceless kiss, my weaponless hands, your smile?
And I remember when I first went to Vietnam, the first guy I treated was an 18, 19-year-old kid that stepped on a bouncing Betty, and I remember running up and him saying, "Doc, Doc, I'm going to live, ain't I?" I said, "Sure, babe," and I held his hand, he died. And I cried, and I cried, and I cried. So I got to the point where I couldn't cry again. So I got to the point where I'm saying, I'm going to stand up to it in a firefight and end this all. I got wounded twice over there. I came back, and one of the greatest gifts I feel that Vietnam Veterans Against the War gave me, in 1969, when Kent State and everything happened, I heard about this group. I started forming a chapter in San Francisco, and VVAW gave me the human dignity to be able to cry again. And I want to thank Barry and Shelley and the rest of the people for that.
I don't think I'm going to have another opportunity to thank each and every one of you individually, so I just want to do this now. I've been looking for you guys since 1968. I was in the Marines from all of 67 through all of 70, and I'm not going to tell you a war story except that I was a war resistor, and I wound up going anyway. I want to thank you for being a major factor in saving my life, for transforming it from one of just a day-to-day survival to beginning to be a regular human being again. The rap groups, you know, and the vet centers, and the PTSD stuff, and the Agent Orange stuff. I started crawling out of the woodwork a couple of years ago, and I participated because of the work you guys had done. And I especially want to thank you all for helping me realize I'm not nuts.
I think it's been in the interest of the powers that be to characterize those who have experienced war and who have become aware of its insanity. You see, war is the insanity. It's not those who react to the insanity who are insane. So it has been in their interest to lead us to think that we who experienced it and whose sensitivities has morally repulsed us and have reacted accordingly, to make us think that we are the ones who are insane. Therefore, we have tried over the years to put Vietnam behind us, to forget Vietnam. I don't want to forget Vietnam. I don't want anyone else to forget Vietnam. And when we try to help people with healing, we don't want them to forget Vietnam. Because we are all a part of our experiences, and Vietnam was a very important experience for us.
During Desert Shield, I started to write to an Army infantryman from the same town that I come from, South Boston. His unit actually made contact with the Iraqi Army. He was a gunner on a Bradley armored fighting vehicle. The Bradley was disabled by a recoilless round. He pulled the driver out and was decorated. When he come home, he was ebullient, you know. During the whole time I was writing to him, I wasn't speaking politically to him. I was giving him the benefit of my experience as a survivor only. And when he got home, I met him and got together an old soldiers meeting, and we talked to him about our experience in Vietnam and his experience, what we knew of his experience. And I don't know how much, I didn't know how much at the time I had gotten through to him. Within a couple of months, though, he had left the Army. He was complaining of sleep disruptions. He was drinking heavily, and I convinced him to find some help. I convinced him to get political. This is called for DC, Corporal D Company, 41st Infantry, Operation Desert Storm. Look, it doesn't matter, little brother, if it lasted 4 years like my old man's or 4 days like yours. The beast will live and breathe as long as you do, sometimes full-blown in your head. Its breath foul with flash and flesh, addling your senses. And the people, friends and enemies alike, will once again have lungs and limbs shredded, lose heads and hearts and hands. Their blood and brains will again mist the bunkers and fighting holes in the cabins of ACAVs. and still they won't die. And you'll shake or wake, as we all do, wishing and wondering if the war will ever end.
We've had a number of Gulf War veterans join VVAW. When we meet them here and there, they don't like call up and join usually, but when people do speaking in schools to students in college or whatever, or we've met some like at the stand down, you know, guys that were volunteering. We met Buzz, for instance.
My name's David Doyle, known as Buzz to a lot of people. I'm a Gulf War veteran. As far as being a neatly packaged little war, there's hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers on the Iraqi side that were killed. Mass graves that nobody's ever going to really know about. Where I was glad to be home and alive and safe and whatnot, and that the war was over, the parades and all of the yellow ribbons around all the trees and everything seemed like everybody was just sitting there saying, "Yay, team," and patting me on the back for being part of this thing that I think is vile, this, you know, this incredible destruction that I couldn't agree with anymore.
You remember in the Vietnam War, when I came out, there was a social movement against the war that I could plug into. These guys don't have it. So they're out there, you know, and there's no social pressure against that war. There's no one else they can go talk to about it or at all. So they're really suffering in a very isolated, lonely way, most of them. So when they come to us, it's like coming back home, I think, even though we're older. And we don't talk to them like the Legion or someone else would. We don't tell them their war wasn't a real war or any of that bullshit. We don't even tell them our war stories. We listen to their war stories if they want to talk about it. Because we finally learned the hard way, you know, what it was like for us.
What I get out of doing things like the homeless stand down, when I can anyway, is that it helps me to carry on for myself and to cope with myself and my head and my experiences. For me, if I can help them, I can keep it in the back of my head that I don't have to be that way if I continue to do things like this and keep myself a level head and surround myself with other people that are doing the same thing. I guess it's that I don't like the deal that I got out of the military. And if I can help somebody else that got a raw deal, then I want to be able to do that. And at the same time, it's also helping me.
All of you big, strong men, Uncle Sam needs your help again. Got himself in a terrible jam, way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books, pick up a gun, gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam, and it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. Come on, Wall Street, don't be slow. Ah, man, this is war a go-go. There's plenty good money to be made. Supplying the army with the tools of the trade. Just up and pray if they drop the bomb. They drop it on the Viet Cong. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next up is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. We're all gonna die. Now come on, generals, let's move fast. Your big chance is here at last. Now you can't go out Forget those Reds, only good commie is one that's dead. You know that peace can only be won when they run them all the kingdom come. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next up is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7. Open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. Now come on, mothers throughout the land. Pack your boys off to Vietnam. Come on, fathers, don't hesitate. Send your daughters off before it's too late. Be the first one on your block to have your kids come home in a box. And